All right, so I wanted to talk about this thing about source code software because it just came up, and this is an important thing because it really shows that whoever was writing this document for Zamad doesn't have any development experience and doesn't understand the development side of things and really not the IT sides of things. Because even on the IT side, we need to understand what software is, right? Maybe at a much more rudimentary level, but we certainly need to know what source code is. And we used to have to know this all the time because we used to work commonly with source code back in like the 90s. Today, you may go years without ever touching source code and not be aware, or not needing to compile source code, I'm sorry, and not be really very aware of it at all, because when we do need binaries, we get them as binaries, and there's good reasons for that. And I have videos on my Sam IT channel about that, why that is, why we don't, as IT professionals, we don't compile software. That's generally not a thing. If you're compiling your own software, there can be an edge case for that, but generally you would want to stop and say, wait, why am I doing this? I'm getting weird, right? This is not an IT process. That is you want developers doing your compilation in essentially all cases. And having IT do it is generally a failure somewhere, and normally it's a failure of IT, where IT starts to get, like, literally we use the term getting weird. Someone starts thinking that they need to tune something that they don't need to tune. They think that it gives them some control. They want to make it difficult so it's not easy to maintain for whatever reason. Those are bad things, right? There's generally not a good reason. Anyway, so understanding there are two types of software. All software has to be compiled somehow into zeros and ones at the end of the day. The computer only understands zeros and ones. How do we get there? Traditionally, or the way that people tend to think of it, is by compilation. We actually use a tool called a compiler, and it will take our source code, which is generally written in like Notepad, right? It's just text. There's rarely anything different. You go in and you take that, and the compiler takes that, reads the source code, and produces a pre-built binary. Pre-built binary is the key component here. The compiler moves it from being text, and the source code isn't needed once you do that. So we call this a binary. If you're on Windows, this is a .exe, right? If you're on Linux, it's an ELF file, but it doesn't have the extension, but it's still binary, just the same as it is on Windows. So this, you can't open it up and read anything. It's all zeros and ones. It's machine language. But that's what the computer is able to run. That's the only thing that it understands. The handy thing about this is you compile your software. You don't have to give anyone your source code. They don't have to see how you did it. They don't have to see what you were thinking. They only see how it runs. And that tends to be really fast because the computer doesn't have to do anything. It's already done for it. So we traditionally do a lot of things in binary format, and certain things like an operating system have to be binary. There's no option, right? Because there's nothing else. Like, it just has to run right on the hardware. Hypervisors, they have to be binary. The other option for software is what's called interpreted code. And that's still written the same way. It's written in Notepad or whatever. It's text. But instead of having a compiler turn it into binary ahead of time, it instead is executed by a piece of software that itself is a binary called an interpreter that reads the file line by line, or the whole thing at once, and then produces the zeros and ones of machine language on the fly as it goes. So you say, print something on the screen. It says, how do I do that? It takes that line, turns it into machine code, and feeds it to the computer in real time. So that takes more work, but it's so much less work for the human involved that we often do interpreted code for almost all business software, in fact, and a lot of websites, right? So whether a language is compiled or interpreted is almost always determined by the language itself. There are exceptions to that. There are some that can be done both ways, and there are some in-between things that make it a little bit confusing. But we're going to ignore those cases and say that languages are either compiled or interpreted, and it's the language that determines that. So C, C++, C#, Java, those are all compiled languages, or essentially so. PHP, Perl, Python, JavaScript, those are all interpreted languages. Ruby, in this case for Zamad, an interpreted language. So knowing what language you have tells you how it's going to behave, how you have to behave it. Do you have to prep to use it, and so you get source and turn it into something? Or is it always source and that's just what you work with? So if you're going to go get WordPress, for example, that is a PHP application, or Zamad, in this example, it is a Ruby on Rails application, you download, one way or another, the thing that you result in is having the source code. And then when you run it, the interpreter, the PHP interpreter in the case of WordPress, and the Ruby on Rails interpreter, Ruby interpreter in the case of Zamad, goes line by line and reads the source code and tells the computer what to do in real time as it does that. There is no exception. That is how it works, right? So by knowing it's a Ruby application, we know that no matter what we do at the end of the day, we're going to put source code on the computer and run it through an interpreter. So the problem with this document is that it says source as one install option and then other things as other install options as if they're not source. It makes no sense whatsoever. All of those installation options are source installation. All equally source. Not one's not more source than another. That's not how it works, right? They're text. They're all the same text. They're just different methods of getting that text onto the computer. One is downloading what is basically a zipped file. It's called a tarball, but that's just a form of zip, right? It's just a different format of zip. And the others use repositories that are automatically updated and easier to maintain. The RPM repository, the Debian, the Deb repository, those are the other options. All of them are putting the exact same files in the exact same places in the exact same way. One just makes you do it manually and the others do it for you. That's it. Nothing else to it. So why would someone call this source? This goes back a long way. We used to, in the Unix world, when we were working with files that had to be binaries, so things in C and C++ primarily, and we did this a lot. We used to get our software this way quite often. We would download the source. This is only applied to open source projects, really. We would download the source. We would then get a compiler, or already have it. We would then compile that source into a binary. Then we would take the binary we just created and we would deploy it in some way. When we did that, it was common to download the source, but only common, as a tarball. So we would get the tarball, we would use a set of tools, compile it, and then we'd have a binary and have to deploy it. What's happened here, and then RPMs and deb files traditionally do not do that, although they can technically. They normally would have the binary already built into them. So people, a very small group of people, with a very small subset of experience where they were commonly working in open source, they were commonly getting them as tarballs, and they were also working with repos and didn't understand any of those things and confused them with other things they were doing at the time. And so it's this really isolated set of things that would make this happen. Confuse the concept of a zip file with the concept of compilation. So if you can imagine this on Windows, it would be like you tend to download certain products that are zipped and other products you tend not to download as a zip file. And instead of thinking of zipping as a compression tool, you started accidentally thinking of it as whatever this resulting file was, right? So if you always zipped, say, database files and you didn't zip photographs, you might start thinking that zip is a database format or something, when of course it's not. It's just a way to save space on the disk and to make lots of files easy to move around as one file. That's it. That's all tarball is too. It is exactly analogous to zip. It's just older and has a funny name. So this is someone who confused the concept of zipping with the concept of how we compile software. A pretty big misstep, and it's one we see over and over again with people using the term source for deployments today. Generally, everything we deploy is source. And some people also confuse when they use things like Git and repos like that pull the source directly straight from a source repository as being source, and things that have the source code already packaged in some way without a repository or without its own repository as not being source. Also just as confusing and just as wrong, right? The source that comes in from an RPM package is not different than the source that it gets pulled down by Git. Now, you may interact with those things in a different way, but that's irrelevant. It's all equally source. So when you're dealing with Zamod, it's always source. All those things, always source. And when you need to actually compile, it's really not going to come up. No one's going to offer you software in that way or make you do it. Most open source software, if it can be compiled, offers it so that you can compile it yourself, but don't. No one who's taking their project seriously makes you do that, right? That's for hobbyists, and that's fine. It's great that hobbyists can do it. It's great that people who are looking to develop and test code can do it, but for you as an IT professional, that's not something you're going to do. It makes no sense. So that is why this isn't source, and that's almost guaranteed to be why the person who wrote this got confused. It's they don't understand compression and file formats. They don't understand software and code. They don't know what compilation is, and they perceive the tarball compression format as somehow being tied to things being source, and they think that RPMs and debs are somehow ways to deploy binaries. They are not. None of that is true. It is a whole series of misunderstandings of all the components here, both IT and software, all being layered on top of each other, and someone just went wildly astray and started referring to that as source. That is the underlying problem. And now that you know that, it's easy to recognize projects do this all the time. I can only imagine that somehow they have someone. What's weird is you have to pretty much be really old to have had the experience that would lead you to this misconception, but you have to be at the level of an intern within that space to not be aware of it being so wildly wrong. So it's weird to have had people who worked in a spot where they were compiling things, but also have so little experience that they have no idea what compilation is. Now, to have people who have not touched any of this, that makes sense, because like if you come from the Windows world and never work with open source, you never run into any of it. So, okay, source is a whole new concept. That makes sense. But to be in the position to have made such a leap into thinking that this was a source deployment rather than just another way of deploying source, and that the other things aren't source but binaries, requires a bunch of assumptions that you would normally only have under very specific circumstances. So hopefully that helps clear up the misunderstanding here.